I graduated in '71, even though my expected graduation year was 1970. I was in the 1970 year was the Kent State riots on campus, and there was some delay of a graduation by some, and so I went back to my senior year, my super senior year in 1970-71, and I took a light load because I only had a few credits to finish. And at that time, I got a call, or someone did at the chapter, from the international headquarters, which was located down in New York City in Midtown, wondering if there was anyone at the Phi chapter who might be interested in working part-time for the international headquarters. I was available. I thought it was a good opportunity for me, so I would take the subway down from the Bronx 2 or 3 days a week and work in what's called the back office at that time. It was located at just off the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue in Manhattan. At the end of the first year, and when I actually got my degree from NYU, I was asked by the assistant executive director, at that time executive secretary, to go on the road for Zeta Psi and actually be the chapter consultant. And not having any other firm plans, I decided that was a good opportunity for me. I took the bid in the second semester of my freshman year. We had a semester-long pledge period, which we don't advocate these days, that's for sure. In fact, it was so protracted that it lasted over the next summer. So I came back to NYU a week early before classes started for my, sorry to have to say this on film, but it was the Hell Week. And again, I'm not proud of this, but there was a lot of hazing going on back then. Things that we wouldn't allow today, and for good reason, because there were some emotional injuries that were inflicted upon me and my fellow there were 5 of us in the pledge class, all of whom I've remained close with. And I'll tell you that there was some ill will that was created at that time for really inane stuff. The advantages to fraternities really start at the level of what is real brotherhood, what is the creation of these long-time friendships, the ones that we advertise and promote as the ones who will be in your wedding party, which 2 of my fellow pledge brothers were in my wedding party, and then carrying your casket at your funeral. That's really what fraternity is about in a long, if it's done right, and if it's a long-lasting friendship that's created. I had the opportunity, as I say, to visit with other chapters during my year as a consultant, and then I did a lot of travel for Zeta Psi in my first several years, if not all the years I was with Zeta Psi. I tried to get to every chapter at least once every 2 years or so, even as executive director. But in the first year, I visited every chapter that there was. And by doing that, I established different types of friendships and relationships. And many of them have been lifelong as well. It didn't matter that they didn't go through the same experience that I did at the undergraduate level. There was that connection that Zeta Psi was important to them as it always has been to me. You know, when I would travel, I would have almost a second home at times with some people that I enjoyed their company, they enjoyed mine, and we developed important family relationships that transcended our own affiliation of Zeta Psi and became good friends. Doug Donaldson and I have been very close for now over 40 years. I remember when I was an undergraduate going up between New York and Massachusetts, University of Connecticut was right on the way. So when they still had a house that was owned by the university, I stopped in one time on the way in, and Doug was the guy that I met. And he invited me in, showed me around, and was cordial. The first year I was on the road, I stopped off Theta Chapter at the University of Connecticut. Was one of my first stops. And so Doug was still in the chapter. I think he was Phi at the time, and invited me into a chapter meeting. And we sang the opening ode, Zeta Psi We Pledge Tonight. And we never sang the second verse in my own chapter. So when it came around to them singing the second verse, I was stumped. And he knew it and everyone else knew it. So they threw me in the shower for not knowing the second verse. And that started a friendship that has lasted all these years. He went to my wedding, I went to his wedding. We've enjoyed many good times. He became Phi Alpha. He was one of my bosses for the 2 years I was with him. And you know, there's hardly anyone more dependable as a Zeta brother that I think of as Doug Donaldson. He's an incredible guy. And loves this organization throughout his entire being. I come back to conventions every year because I want to maintain that as an important part of my life. It is. It's a week out of every year. And when I was the chief operating officer, the executive director, obviously it was an intense week of work. My wife comes almost every year, and we enjoy the company of other people that we've known and become very close to over the years. So I have far more Zeta Psi friends outside of my own chapter than I do within the chapter. And as a result of that, I'm an unusual Zeta in that respect. My Zeta Psi affiliation significantly transcends my own chapter because I have the ability to interact and become friends with so many people, hundreds, without being immodest, really thousands of people that I've had relationships with in some form or another as they were undergraduate leaders and become elder leaders and attending conventions and whatnot. Building elder associations takes a good deal of effort and skill and salesmanship, because if someone asks, how can I get involved? You have to provide them with something right off the bat. Now sometimes that's involvement in a regional association, and they can take the reins and run with it, or their own elder association, which they need some guidance typically that the IHQ can provide. But one thing that I can tell you from my long experience with our organization and with the Greek experience, which I've been very much involved in over the years, is there's almost a one-to-one relationship between strength at the elder chapter and strength at the undergraduate chapter. I am the elder association of the Zeta chapter at Yale, which is not even my own chapter, but I've served on their board ever since Henry Elliott, who was a Zeta in the class of 45, asked me to join their board, their elder board, back in the 70s when I was the executive director. And it carried through for a number of years. So Doug Donaldson and I, he's not a Zeta from Yale either, have carried the torch for their elder association. And when I picked it up back in 2010, they were proposing, my predecessor, excuse me, decided that he would, that it was time to sell the house. And I said, no, I'm going to make sure that this house, because it's a good location. It's not the finest house by any means, but it's a good location. And so I took it over. Sims McGrath from the Phi Lambda chapter was helpful in reorganizing it. Doug continued to work, but I'm in the process right now of actually transitioning to some Zetas from Yale, and hopefully that will happen. To elders, I would say, remember the good days, because for almost all of us, the fraternity was a formative experience and a fun experience, and an opportunity to make lifelong friendships. Too many elders, they move away, they get married and have families, and they dismiss this as part of their former lives. We know the percentages of elders that get involved is probably less than 20%, and those the other 80% generally talk about I was a Zeta, and many of us, we don't like to hear that I am a Zeta and always will be a Zeta. And so if I have any advice to elders, it is I am a Zeta, and I feel it was an important part of my life, and especially in the 4 years that I was an undergraduate. But it can also be an important part of their life going forward. The Zetas at Cornell, for instance, there's a group of 25 or 30 that get together with their families in all sections of the United States every year or two, including their families. And there's hardly anything closer in their lives than the relationships that they made and continue today. For undergraduates, we don't use it in our fraternity, but some others do. Be your brother's keeper. Act responsibly. Act with honor. And understand that your actions reflect the organization in which you joined. If you can't be, oftentimes I'm asked, can we do this? And so, typically it involves a pledge program, an education program, or on the verge of what might be considered hazing. And typically I would respond to them and say, would you invite your mother or the Greek advisor to come in and observe what you just told me? And oftentimes the answer is probably not. Then I respond that it's probably hazing, or it's probably not appropriate. So to the undergraduates, I would say, have fun. That's part of what we do. Make the friendships and that will last throughout the rest of your lives. But understand that you must act responsibly too, because it reflects on the entire organization when you screw up. And unfortunately, it happens. But when it happens, apologize, make restitution if you've caused any damage, and just move on to the next phase of your undergraduate experience with the sense that this is something that's very important to me and important to Zeta Psi, that you act responsibly. Back in 1972, when I was first starting as executive director, a Zeta pretty much my age, by the name of Jay Rothberg, came into my office. Jay was in student affairs, I think at Rider College at the time, and he was the founding member of our Delta Chi chapter at American University. But that chapter had a fire, and as a result of the fire and the diminution of the Greek system at that particular time, the chapter did not last more than 2 or 3 years. So he wanted to, in a sense, repay for the relatively brief experience he had, and he knew that that contribution would be best served at the international level than his own chapter, because his chapter, like mine actually, had ceased to exist, had become dormant. I'm pleased to say that both of our chapters are now very strong, robust. But back then, I was looking for someone to guide me through the process of student activities and how fraternities were part of the university system. Of course, it varies from campus to campus. In his case, he was very astute in understanding the process of student affairs and student personnel administration. And so he guided me through the process. And so, in essence, we became an expansion team, the two of us. Here was this Irishman running around with this somewhat diminutive Jewish guy who we were both good at what we could play off each other, but we were a successful team in going into chapters. And so the first chapter that we started was our Untitled Chapter at Lehigh University, which was chartered in '73. And then we went into start we took on the chapter at University of Maryland in '76, my son's chapter at WPI at Worcester Polytech, the chapter at Tulane in '77, Virginia Tech in '75. So it was a series of both reactivations and in my own chapter at NYU in '75. So there was a lot of expansion activity that occurred, and I doubt that would have occurred to the same level it did without Jay Rothberg coming into my office and saying, "What can I do to help?" Back in 1972, when I started with the headquarters and I became the executive director, I was kind of fishing through a maze that I was not aware of what I was supposed to do. But the one thing that was in effect at the time was the chapters were billed for fees. That was the major income source, and that we had what was called an annual dues program for our elder brothers, where we sent out notices on the addressograph machine, which I referred to earlier, and asked them for $25, $50, whatever it was. And back when Jim McLaughlin was in his second year, or maybe third year as Phi Alpha, by the way, I'm going to interrupt to say that there's only been two 3-year term Phi Alphas in our long history. One by Jack Colson, who was a Dartmouth Zeta, and Jim McLaughlin, who was a Zeta from Toronto. And Jim was really my mentor. If there was one person that I would look to say, well, who got you started in terms of your association with the International, it was certainly Jim McLaughlin. Jim died tragically. He was a relatively young man in his early 50s, but he had a cerebral hemorrhage. He was with a group of his fellow brothers from Toronto up in his Northern Ontario cabin one weekend, and he had what was a irreparable shock to his system, and he died a few days later. But Jim also saw the need for us building some capital within the organization, so he retained the services of a fundraising consulting firm to do what's called a feasibility study, just something I do professionally now for the clients that I serve. And at that time, they came back and said, you can do a lot better than an annual dues program. You should establish what's called an annual fund program. And in the early years of the 1980s, through the impetus of Henry Elliott, who was another one of certainly my mentors, and was certainly considered one of the premier volunteer Zetas through the last century, he encouraged us to look into the opportunity of a major capital campaign, which at that time was called the Campaign for Endowment. We outsourced the program to a guy who was ultimately I went to work for, but I finished that up back in probably '85, '86, and one of the primary subsections or mini campaigns of that capital campaign was the Headquarters 100 campaign, which was an effort to raise $500,000 for the purchase and renovation of a permanent headquarters, which we hadn't had since the Zeta Psi Club on East 39th Street in Manhattan was sold well before my time, probably the early 60s, mid 60s. But so I went with Jim Youngland, another mentor, and Roy Folk, both of whom became Phi Alphas of Zeta Psi. We went up to visit a brother of mine from the Phi chapter who owned some apple orchards up in Red Hook, New York, north of where we lived in Pearl River. And we asked him for a major gift. And he came back and said, well, I'm not going to give you $100,000, but I'll write a check today for $5,000. And if you're trying to raise $500,000, you can get another 99 people to contribute. By the way, that violates all the tenant rules of capital fundraising. You need a 10%er, you need all sorts of things like that. And yet, going back to that time in the mid-'80s, before I became a professional fundraising consultant, we succeeded, and we filled up we raised 100. In fact, there's a plaque in the front foyer of the headquarters with all the names of the 100 people that created the headquarters 100. So that was the first campaign. As we were approaching the 150th anniversary of Zeta Psi, a former staff member of mine by the name of Jack Doyle from the Kappa chapter at Tufts influenced us. He was on the board at the time, and influenced us to go out and establish what's called a Heritage Society. It's a subset of Zetas who have indicated that they will leave a legacy for Zeta Psi in their will or through insurance, or typically a deferred gifts. In some cases they decided to pay it off. Very few. In most cases it's a deferred gift. But we set a goal of trying to achieve a charter membership of 150 Zetas to coordinate with our 150th anniversary, to be chartered at the convention in New York City in that year, 1997, and we achieved that goal. And our original goal was maybe 1.5 million in deferred gifts, and that first year it was we had if we added them all together of people, what they would indicate, what they would do in deferred giving, it was over $4 million. So it certainly exceeded our expectations. But in order to inaugurate this program, we set up a reception at our convention in '97 here back in New York, and we've done it every year since. The success of the Heritage Society has exceeded all of our expectations, quite frankly. We have at least frankly almost triple the number that we started as charter members. So there are approximately 450 members, of which maybe 53 are deceased and have already provided well over $4 million to our to add to our endowments and other programs of the international. And then the gift expectations beyond that are well in excess of probably $10 million. Now, that's not going to be achieved in my lifetime, but hopefully Zeta Psi will be very well endowed in years to come. The challenges right now are to build capital for the mushrooming that we've had of their membership education program. So back in 2.5 years ago, we started a capital campaign to endow principally the membership endowment program, membership education program, but also other funding vehicles of the Educational Foundation. We set a goal of 3.5 million, and right now we're at about 3 million that we've raised. So we're likely to succeed in that campaign as well. The essence of our organization is lifelong friendships. And those lifelong friendships can be better enhanced when alumni decide to continue their support of that. And oftentimes that involves volunteer service, but in my case, and as a fundraiser, it also involves making a significant financial commitment in some cases. And we have some people in the Heritage Society that are prepared to leave $1 million or more to Zeta Psi. We've already gotten one that by the name of Richard Clark. He was Alpha chapter class of '33, was a New Yorker who moved to Seattle in his later life, and I would visit him all the time. And I always knew that he was going to be generous to Zeta Psi, but he ended up leaving us $1.6 million in his estate. And with no strings attached. He basically said this is an important part of his life, and there'll be more of those, just because everyone has to have a will, and everyone has to die, and everyone should consider that, hey, maybe Zeta Psi can be part of my distribution. My recollection of older Zates were, there's one in particular that was sort of an enigma to me, because he had been known as Mr. Zeta Psi for a good part of the last century. His name was Arthur, nicknamed Red Motley. He was head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Parade Magazine, and various other dignified positions. But he moved, he was a Zeta at the University of Minnesota, but he had moved out to the California desert. And so I only met him a couple of times, but he was a larger-than-life figure. He was class of 2022, I think. But I've known Zates as far back as, I think, the oldest one had a class year of probably 1912, going way, way back. And of course, many of those who were dignitaries before I became involved would show up at conventions or other events. So the ones that I was most familiar with, Roy Folk, who was mentioned before, he was Roy Folk Jr., but his dad, Roy Folk Sr., was the class of 19 at Bowdoin College, and I knew him very well, and he had a long life. There was a Zate from Syracuse who, let's see, what was his class? I think he might have been 1911, but his name was Charlie Burroughs. Actually, it was probably before then, because he was the guy that always aspired to live to 100 years old, and he did, and he did. Not long after that did his demise come, but nonetheless, he was the newsletter guy for that chapter for probably 50 years. He just and he lived in Syracuse, so it was always a close association. But yeah, I interacted with Zeta. I can't remember any that I knew that had a class year that began with 18. But there were many that I knew that. Of course, by then I had graduated in '70, so if you were connecting back, they had to have been in their 80s or 90s if they had class years in the first decade of the 20th century. So. I think two very important ones when I was Phi Alpha, the fraternity, from '06 to '08. We had this great experiment of whether or not we could transform the Zeta Psi experience to another nation beyond North America. And so a young man from our Berkeley chapter who had graduated decided to take a year at Oxford University, went over there and started making friends. Some of you may know that are listening to this that Oxford is a university comprised of, I think it's 32 individual small colleges that integrates under the general umbrella of Oxford University. So there's not necessarily a lot of overlap, but in this case, he made friends with a number of people from different colleges. So he came back to the fraternity. I was not the executive director then, but I was the president, and we were dealing with the concept of could this really work for us? Well, this in the old days probably not, because it meant getting on the telephone and taking a flight over there every time. But now, with the internet and more easily adaptable communications devices, we could interact and still go over there every year, but more so that they would come over here and interact with us in North America, both in Canada and the United States. So, I went over there when I was Phi Alpha to the UK, and I was honored to offer a charter to them, and that became one of our Iota Omicron chapter. And how many years later? It's 8, 9 years later, it's still very functional. They're doing well. And then we also brought the experiment to Ireland and for unfortunately a brief period in Scotland at St. Andrews University. But Zeta Psi is a fraternity of firsts, as anyone who's in Zeta Psi knows. That's part of our learning process of knowing that we were the first truly national fraternity with the first chapter on the West Coast at Berkeley in 1870, and the first international fraternity with our chapter at Toronto in 1879. Well, then we became the first intercontinental fraternity as well in 2008 when we awarded a charter to our group at Oxford University. So that was an important part of my experience in being Phi Alpha. In 2011, I was given the Distinguished Service Award of the organization, and the first hire I ever made was George McNeely from our Toronto chapter, who was my first chapter consultant. Many of them, by the way, went on to become Phi Alphas, and he was one of them. He was the one that gave the introduction for my Distinguished Service Award, and that was exactly 10 years after 9/11, 2001. So I must say, as one who lived through that, being a resident of the New York metropolitan area, I looked, we had the convention across the Hudson River in Jersey City, but we were looking at what had been created as the new tower, with the absence of the Twin Towers, which was a painful experience for all of us that went through it, and many of those in D.C. area where you are also had the experience with the Pentagon. But looking back 10 years at that point, now 15 as we're talking today, that was a transformative experience as well. And we lost 5 Zetas in that in 9/11. Did not know personally any of them, but one of them lives on essentially in perpetuity from our chapter at Rutgers, because he was part of the major investment firm that was stricken by 9/11. One thing in society today is that there's a certain sense that marriages don't work all that well sometimes, or maybe 50% of the time. I'm a really lucky guy. I married a girl that has been my best friend, and we're married for now 42 years. Been together for 44. We've raised 3 children. We have so family has to be the central part of my existence, other than what I interact with Zeta Psi. But I also I play tennis. Try to play 3 times a week. I still play singles, even at my age. I'm hopefully never having to get to doubles, although some in my age group tend to go that way. So and it's competitive. I play some former college players and so forth on a regular basis, and I do okay. I play poker. I like poker. I enjoy the interaction. I have a weekly game that I try to get to. And beyond that, there's not much other than service of my clients. I've been very fortunate to do capital campaigns for at least 35 different organizations over my career, and most recently at Cornell. I've worked for, now I'm with my 7th fraternity, and it happens to be Zeta Psi, so I'm very pleased about that. But in each case, they've raised well in excess of $1 million for house renovations and whatnot, and so that's a common that's a part of my life. Obviously, it's my career as well, but I see no retirement in the immediate horizon. It keeps me busy. It keeps me generating a lot of interest in continuing to promote the Greek system, whether it's Zeta Psi or another fraternity. Some will say, "Oh, you had me until you talked about this." I'm a big Red Sox fan, and so when 2004 hit, there was a big relief in my life at that time, and I follow Boston sports, and even though I've been a New York resident for more than two-thirds of my life. And I belong to an organization called the Blowhards, which it stands for the Benevolent Loyal Order of the Honorable and Ancient Red Sox Die-Hard Sufferers of New York. Now, we're not sufferers anymore these days, but the organization exists, and in 2 weeks I'm headed to Yankee Stadium for the last Red Sox game that David Ortiz will be involved in, and I'll be bringing another Zeta by the name of Tyler Boisvert, who happens to work for Zeta Psi and is a big Red Sox fan like I am. But if I had you before then, I suppose I've turned off half the people that are observing this by saying that. But nonetheless, I grew up with that pedigree, and I continue to follow them very closely. The most important thing, I believe, that I've learned from being a Zate is that friendships can be created because of the affiliation itself. I believe that that there's a commonality, obviously. We have the same, everyone has the same ritual no matter what chapter they're from. And I've been blessed with just having a lot of people that I feel that I can interact with socially, athletically, and you know, that they've become lifelong friends. It's other than that, I mean, quite frankly, it's been a career for me. It's given me a career. It's given me a career that's been somewhat independent of, you know, the work a day, going in an office. Sure, I go in an office, but it's my office, and I've been generally the chief coordinator of activities. So sure, there's been some personal advantages, but I think that the main advantage is that I enjoy the fraternity a great deal, and I always will. Back in the first convention, I was the go-to guy with the hotel at that time. I was still relatively young in my position.
And when was this again?
This was 1980. We're at the Royal Orleans, upgrade, an upstage hotel in the French Quarter, and my wife and I would. She was there, and you know, we went to bed reasonably early because I had to get up in the morning and do stuff to organize the convention. But I got a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever, and it was from the hotel security, and they said, "We think we have one of yours passed out someplace. Can you come and identify him?" So I got up, put on some clothes, met the security guy. We went into the back stairway of the hotel, and there was this young man sort of passed out, lying on the floor of the stairway. And he says, "Is this one of your undergraduates?" I said, "I don't know, but probably." And so we kindly took him in. We took him into our room, put him at the end of our bed, put a blanket on him, and went back to bed. In the morning, we got up. We had a thing, and you know, we get the call from the hotel. Got up, and woke the guy up, and I said, "Are you a Zeta? You remember a Zeta Psi?" And he says, "Yeah. Who are you?" And I says, "I'm Greg McElroy." And he says, "Oh, damn." He might have said some other words, but I won't say it on camera. so he knew who I was. I didn't necessarily know. I didn't see him again during the rest of the convention. I think he was a little embarrassed by this. I specifically remember walking into the Beta chapter at the University of Virginia, which has had a reputation of being aloof and exclusive, elitist in a certain sense. And I walked up to the front porch of their majestic Jeffersonian property on Rugby Road in Charlottesville, identified myself, and one of the young men on the porch said, "So are you the revenuer from the Nationals?" I said, well, I guess if you're going to describe it as that, I suppose that's what I am. But I'm here to help as well. So the Beta chapter in my early years with the organization, with the headquarters, was a close chapter to mine because my own experience, NYU Uptown, where I was a Zeta, closed in the early 70s. And as a result of that, the chapter had to close for a period of time when I was starting to work for the International as a chapter consultant. At the end of that year, we had our convention. The first convention I attended was in Halifax in 1971, and the next year was our convention in Boston, so I was essentially back home for the first one that I was totally on staff as a staff member. And I was very surprised towards the end of the convention when the then Phi Alpha, Jim McLaughlin, the Alpha Phi Alpha, Peter Packarduni, and the Gamma Alpha, Don Harmer, called me into a session in one of their suites and said, we have decided to consolidate, because of some financial issues and others, the positions of executive secretary, which was called at the time, assistant executive secretary, and you, the chapter consultant, into one position. And so they offered me the job as executive secretary, which was again changed a year or two later at my urging, frankly. And so I became probably the youngest executive director of Zeta Psi, certainly in the 70 years prior to my doing that. I don't know how it was, and well before my time. But it was quite a surprise. It was a welcome change to me, but there was a lot of rebuilding to do basically at that time. So that's sort of my introduction, how I got there. I never expected or planned for it to be a career, but it was for 25 years of my life. And they're very rewarding. Met my wife through Zeta Psi, and it was a wonderful career for me. But as I was approaching the age of 50, I decided maybe there was something else in it for me, but I've stayed extremely close to Zeta Psi ever since.